New lessons coming soon. That is a sneak peek at some of the upcoming lessons, but let's talk about today. Today we are painting a tropical beach scene. This was actually inspired by a 10-minute painting lesson, this painting lesson. And as per usual, if you have any questions, let me know. If you'd like help with the drawing process, there's the digital sketch up on Patreon with the grid lines and all of that. You can print it out or you can freehand sketch with it. But completely forgot what I was going to say. Completely forgot. That said, if you want any of these hour-long lessons, they are up over on Patreon, along with the digital sketches, along with royalty-free photos, and all of that. But today, here, there's this video. So enjoy, have fun, and if you'd like to share your work with me, you can always send it to me over on Facebook. I'd love to see it. I should probably stop rambling. Let's jump into the video. Greetings and welcome to today's hour-long painting lesson. We're going to begin here today, as we generally do, with a large damp square-headed brush and some titanium white paint. Now, as you can see, I'm going to begin coating the entirety of the sky here with this white titanium paint, and I'm essentially just going to begin by creating a fairly even base layer across the entirety of it. Now here I'm going back to my palette and I'm grabbing about a mixture of half primary blue and half titanium white. Then I'm taking that to the top of my sky and I'm going to begin blending downwards predominantly with horizontal strokes. And I'm doing this because I want to create a gradient in the sky. I want the horizon to be fairly bright. It's going to be much more white, and then as we slowly progress upwards, it's going to get more blue. It's also going to create a little bit of a vignette, which is really nice. The viewer's eye naturally goes to the brightest portion of any picture or painting, and if we keep the horizon much brighter, it'll direct the viewer's eye towards that horizon and towards the center of our piece. Now I'm going to go back to my palette here. I'm grabbing some burnt umber, I'm grabbing some of that titanium white, and I'm going to begin kind of incorporating the sand here at the bottom of my painting. And I'm applying this now as opposed to anything else because I want to work on top of it. I want the water that I'm going to be painting to rush forward on top of it. I want the grass and rocks on either side of it to be overlapping it. So while it's in the foreground, it's really the farthest thing away in the layering process. That's also why we started with the sky, because everything we'll be painting will be layered on top of it. And that's generally how I'd advise to go about your painting. Now, I'm working on some mountains here in the background. I'm using a mixture yet again of burnt umber and titanium white. I'm using a medium-sized square-headed brush because, again, it does have those sharp areas, but it can pick up a good amount of paint. And I'm just essentially giving it a base layer right now. So I'm covering the entirety of the mountain. I'm ensuring that the edges that are touching the sky are nice and sharp because that is essentially, for the most part, the application and detail that is going to go in those areas. We're going to go in and touch it up a little bit, but these lines matter. Now I'm also creating a couple of mountains very far away, as you can see, and that area actually has a lot of titanium white paint on it, so the burnt umber is mixing with that titanium white and we're getting something much brighter. Now, because it's much brighter, it actually looks much farther away because it looks like the light is wrapping around and surrounding it, so we create an extra layer of depth. When you are creating scenes like this and the horizon line is very bright, it has a lot of white in it, and you want your backing subjects to look incredibly bright, add more white to them, allow them to be engulfed in that light, and you're going to get a very neat effect full of depth. Now, this mountain that we're working on is a little bit closer to us, so I'm using some darker pigments. There is titanium white in there, but it's slightly lesser. And as you can see, the tops of the mountains are going to be brighter than the bottom portions. That's because the light can wrap around them much more naturally, and we'll get much more of that bright illuminated effect, where the bottom portions are much more cast in shadow. From the top, the light isn't really surrounding that area. Perhaps trees around the bottom are also going to be creating that effect. And of course, the mountain, again, is just going to be creating shadows upon itself. Now here you can see that I am working with some Mars black in these mixtures, just making sure that that bottom area is nice and dark. And I'm using a combination of that Mars black and titanium white to ensure that the pigment is fairly thick. Now, I've started the painting with a very large area. It was a very large square-headed brush. Then I moved to a medium-sized area. I started using a medium-sized square-headed brush. And now I'm working on some detail on the mountain, so I'm switching over to my smaller square-headed brush. Here I'm taking some primary yellow, some burnt umber, some titanium white, and I'm mixing up a highlight here. And I'm going to begin applying these highlights predominantly to the tops of our mountains, and then I'm going to move them downwards. This can be done with a tapping motion, this can be done with a stroke. If you do more of a tapping motion, you'll get more of that innate coloring on your brush because it won't blend with the pigment on the canvas as much. Or if you want something that's a little bit more cohesive and like soft, you can do more of a stroke and blend in it. But the goal here is to build up highlighted areas that look like pieces of rock that are jetting out. This is going to give it more of a three-dimensional effect, and it's worth noting that I'm using the primary yellow in this mixture to add a bit of warmth to the painting. I didn't want this painting to look too cold. We're going to be using a lot of blues and greens and these colors that are naturally associated with a cool tone, though despite the fact that there can be warm and cool greens and blues and all of that. But aside from that, I wanted to ensure that portions of this painting looked warm and inviting. When you're creating a piece, I like to think about the mood and the atmosphere. If someone were walking into this scene, how would they feel? What emotion do I want to create out of them? And the colors, the tones, all of that, it has a really big effect on all of that emotionally, right? So here, rather than having cool mountains and having more blue highlights, I decided to go with more of that primary yellow instead. Now here I'm switching over to an older square-headed brush. If you watch the 10-minute lessons, you're probably well acquainted with this, but it's essentially a flat square-headed brush that I had. I kind of peeled back all of the bristles on it. I applied pressure, and now because of that, all of the bristles leaf off in varying directions. When I make a tapping motion with it, it gives me just a great number of implications on the canvas, and they are great for the distance, for the background, for the implication of subject. Now, as you can see, I'm starting with a very dark base layer to all of my trees. So I'm getting more of this primary yellow, and then I'm applying this highlight to the tops of my trees, and then kind of slowly working down while also working horizontally. The idea here is that the tops of the trees are much brighter because there's much more light that's going to be hitting them, whereas the bottom of the tree is much darker because there's a lot more shadow cast in that area and the light can't get there. But from there, I'm going to craft some very small little waterfalls here. Now I'm doing this with a little bit of a tapping motion. It's a bit of a tap and drag, and I'm doing this so it looks like the water almost falls, maybe hits a rock or two, falls, maybe hits a rock or two, falls, etc., etc. It just makes it a little bit more interesting than a free-falling line. Then I'm going to take more of that titanium white paint, and I'm just going to paint in a little sun here. It's going to be a small detail, barely noticeable, but I think it definitely adds some life to the painting. Then I'm going to take that same brush, that same pigment, and begin working on my clouds to the right and left hand side of the painting. Now, I haven't talked about this yet in this lesson, but I'm using the smaller round-headed brush because its edges are innately fairly feathered. They're rounded. We don't get a very sharp application. Instead, we get something that's naturally feathered. We get something that dissipates on all edges. So it creates a gradient with a stroke generally. So I like to use this type of brush for things like fog, mist, maybe water that'll have one or two of those elements, and clouds, which we're using right here. So I'm applying this, I'm essentially creating my edge, and then I'm working it downwards in a bit of a circular motion. The circular stroke and application is good. It's going to give it more of a fluffy look. Now I'm going to go back to a larger square-headed brush. I have some primary blue, I have some titanium white, and I'm going to begin working on my water here. So I'm going to smooth out the edges of my trees, as you can see, create more of a straight line. If the line divots inwards a little bit along the tree line, that's fine. It can kind of just look like the water is rushing through portions of these trees. But for the most part, you want this to be fairly straight. Now here I'm taking some additional white paint. I'm applying it in front of our initial application of water, and then I'm blending it back in essentially this Z-like pattern. I'm also going to begin blending it forward. But as I move forward in our painting, as I get closer to us and to the foreground, I'm slowly interjecting more titanium white paint. Here you can see that I'm creating really what's going to be my first little wave. Here I'm creating my second little wave, and I'm just going back and forth like that. Now, these waves are incredibly small. They're just water rushing up, but when you want to make them look realistic at this size, is ensure that the edge that is closest to us is sharp. Then ensure that the backing edge of that stroke dissipates, that it blends backwards. That way you get something that looks like it really is rushing up. Here I'm switching over to the older square-headed brush, the one that we used for the trees in the background. This time we'll be using it for the trees in the foreground. Now here I'm beginning with the foliage on the trees. We'll be layering our branches and vines on top of it. And I'm starting with this because it's essentially the farthest thing away in the tree for the most part. There will be pieces of foliage that are on top of our vines and on top of our branches, but there's also going to be foliage that's the farthest away. So that's what we're starting with. Again, when you are layering these things, when you're creating these things, think about the thing that will be the farthest away and then build on top of it via the layers of your next subjects. So that's what I'm doing. I'm starting predominantly with this very dark green, as you can see. I'm using a tapping motion with this old square-headed brush, and I'm ensuring that when I lift my brush, I'm rotating it slightly in the air, and then I'm pushing it back down on the canvas. This ensures that every tapping motion is different from the next. Now here you can see that we're going back in and we're kind of applying a little bit of a second outer edge here, a little bit of a mid-tone. So the pigment is brighter than the last one, but it's still not bright. We're just building it up. We're applying it along the edges that we feel are going to be receiving the most light, and then we're slowly tapping inwards as the pigment begins to dissipate, creating this light wrapping around our subject. Now, that said, I'm going to begin creating this vine. As you can see, I'm using a smaller square-headed brush. I'm using a mixture of Mars black. I'm using a little bit of primary yellow, and I'm creating vines that hang in different ways. These are kind of framing the mountain, as you can see, and it's going to work as good leading lines. Now I'm using that same brush and I'm still creating my base layer. I'm creating the little pieces of these vines that kind of fall down. I'm trying to ensure that they are all of varying shape, varying size. Some of them are thicker, some of them are more thin, and the space in between them also varies as well. Now here that I have all of my vines in, I'm beginning to add a little bit of a highlight to my vines. I'm starting with the bottom portions and then I'm working it on the top of my vine here as well. I'm still allowing for darker areas to show through. This is just where the light, I think, is going to be hitting the vine for the most part. Now we've completed the foliage, we've also completed the vine, so now I can begin working on the trunk of the tree, the base, the area that most of us would innately think to work on first. Now here I'm using a bit of a burnt umber, I'm using a Mars black, I'm using a bit of a titanium white. I'm using that titanium white and Mars black to again thicken the pigment and to desaturate it a little bit. I didn't want a hyper saturated brown, and I also didn't want to do 15 layers of straight burnt umber until I got something that didn't have the canvas showing through. So that's another little benefit there. Now I'm going to go in and add some depth to these trees. I'm going to take more of a mid-tone, more of a highlight, and begin applying that to the edge of my tree where the light is going to be hitting it. Then it's going to transition into the middle tone and then the dark tone as we move farther back, really creating that depth. Now, the application you use here can actually vary dramatically. You can do more of a classic long stroke following the edge of the tree. This will give the bark a very smooth, soft aesthetic, which is contextually correct to a lot of trees. However, if you want to give the tree a little bit more of a detailed, older aesthetic, you can do the application of the bark with more of a tapping motion. That way it looks like little pieces of highlight and bark are protruding and extending outwards. Now I'm switching to that actually same square-headed brush. It's clean this time, and I'm using some titanium white to add a little bit more life and interest to the water. I'm creating more of those little Z shapes. I'm creating more of those slight little waves, and I'm also adding some of that water that's kind of rushing up and hitting the shore as well. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos, and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.